If I were to tell you to name a great fighter from the Second World War, there are pretty high odds you would say Spitfire or P-51, depending on whether or not you are an American. You might even say Bf-109 or the Zero if you've read a bit further and you don't really want to name an Allied aircraft. But odds are you won't turn around and say IAR-80. Not a lot of attention gets given to the design that came out of Brasov, but when you stop and consider that the aircraft came from a nation with limited industrial resources and no established fighter pedigree, the IAR quickly becomes pretty amazing. It was able to hold its own defending Romanian skies against aircraft from all the major Allied powers. In some cases, it outperformed them too. So today, courtesy of a channel member who's asked not to be named, we're going to talk about it. Welcome back to 5-Minute History, the weekly series where patrons and members choose the topic. This week, we're talking about the IAR-80, and remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hype the video for more. The birth of the IAR can be traced back to the 1920s and the 30s, when the Romanian government backed the creation of several aircraft manufacturers to help ensure the country could keep its air force supplied if foreign suppliers weren't available. See, Romania, while a large country geographically, found itself in a pretty unenviable spot after the First World War, having been occupied by the Central Powers, and also at war's end acquiring a huge swath of land in Transylvania. Money was tight, but the Industria Aeronautical Romana IAR Bureau was established in Brasov in 1925. It quickly became one of the most important aeronautical firms in the country, and they used their limited resources to the absolute best of their ability. This meant that in 1930, when the Romanian government issued a specification for a new fighter, IAR, against all odds, entered the competition anyway. Sadly for the engineers, it did lose, not just once, but twice, both to Polish PZL designs, first the P-11 and later the P-24. But although domestic designers lost out, they did get the contracts to manufacture PZL fighters and gnome-brought engines under license. And this generated enough revenue to keep the design bureau team working, in the background, although this was very much on a shoestring budget. That team, though, was led by engineer Jon Grozu, who fundamentally believed that a low wing configuration made more sense than the gull-wing Polish design that was being utilised by PZL. With this in mind, IAR combined the best bits of the PZL and their own earlier IAR-24 design, and from those building blocks the team began to put together the design that would become the 80. What they came up with was a low-wing all-metal monoplane, with a fuselage that shifted from a circular cross-section near the engine to an egg-shaped profile behind the cockpit. The rear fuselage and engine cowling borrowed heavily from the PZL P-24, while the wing design came from the earlier IAR-24. Now, there is a persistent myth that does claim the wing profile was copied from the Italian Savoia Marchetti SM-79 bomber, but if you actually research and look into it, timelines just don't match up because the SM-79 licensing deal wasn't signed until roughly a year after the prototype had already flown. It's possible that refinements may have been made, but in reality the IAR, while borrowing from others, was its own design, even if it did take notes. The work on the prototype began in late 1937 and it finally took to the air in April 1939, initially powered by an 870 horsepower K-14 engine, a licensed version of the Gnome-Ron Mistral Major. Early test results were really encouraging, and the aircraft was able to reach speeds of about 510 km an hour and reach 16,000 feet in height in about 6 minutes or so. It didn't match the Spitfire or the 109, but it wasn't bad at all, and it looked great doing it too, which is always a bonus. After all these tests, the engineers would add a more powerful engine and lengthen the rear fuselage to balance the aircraft and accommodate the power. They then took the opportunity to add in larger fuel tanks because of the extra space, and a bubble canopy to improve visibility. They also raised the seat to compensate for poor forward visibility while taxiing. The refined design would then be tested against the German HE-112, and it soundly beat the 112, which gave IAR the recognition they deserved nationally, and finally got them a proper contract for 100 aircraft in December 1939. But things weren't perfect, and the 80 would suffer from issues mostly to do with its guns. See, originally the aircraft was going to be armed with 6 Belgian-made machine guns, but the Germans invaded Belgium in 1940, and naturally this kind of screwed with the supply chain. As a stopgap measure, the aircraft's gun power would be cut to 4 guns in order to spread the available weapons out amongst the airframes, but This meant that although the aircraft could fly fast and well, it had no teeth. Following Romanian entry into the Axis, this issue was sort of able to be solved with German imports, and by 1941 the improved IAR-80 finally carried its 6-gun armament, and at last a proper gun sight. Barbarossa, though, would see the aircraft make its combat debut over the Eastern Front, and it was here that Romanian Air Force discovered that, like the Royal Air Force with its 303s, machine guns just weren't cutting it when it came to a modern air war. Again though, Romania and the IAR Bureau were not a major power, and they lacked resources, and so instead of making more and larger weapons, the Romanians took the 13.2mm guns from their bombers, and so the IAR-80B was born, tinkering further, a parallel dive bomber version, where the IAR-81 also entered service, and this was achieved by adding a bomb cradle for level and shallow dive attacks, although this did sacrifice the ability to dogfight effectively. The final major armament upgrade came with the 20mm cannons. At first, these were German MG FFM guns, which led to a design christened the 80C, and later more effective MG 14120 cannon were supplied, which led to the 81C. By 1944, though, the Air Force had taken steps to upgrade the older variants to this new model and provide uniformity amongst the airframes, and it did prove incredibly effective. As mentioned before, the aircraft would make its combat debut on the opening day of Barbarossa in June 41, and it scored its first aerial victory that same day. Through 41 and 42, it served on the southern flank of the Eastern Front, supporting Romanian ground forces and flying air defence missions over the Ploiești oil fields against Allied bomber raids, particularly from the United States coming from the south. The most famous engagement of the 80 came during one of these raids when a US bomber force attempted a low-level ingress raid on the Ploiești oil fields in August 43 as part of Operation Tidal Wave. 80s and 81s operating together attacked the American formation of B-24 Liberators, and according to Romanian sources, they claimed 10 kills during this particular raid. In June 1944, Romanian pilots would take off to intercept a raid engaging with American P-38 Lightnings in low-altitude dogfights. Now, the ending of this fight was largely inconclusive, and both sides did claim victory. It should be mentioned here that accounts of this battle today are so wildly different it's comical depending on whether you read American or Romanian sources. By 1944 and 45, though, the IAR had effectively reached the end of its effectiveness against the P-51s and newer American and Allied aircraft, and the relatively small team supporting them compared to the German Bf-109 couldn't keep up with incremental upgrades. By July 1944, all 80s were withdrawn from frontline combat against American raids, with Bf-109Gs crewed by Romanians taking their place. After Romania's occupation by Soviet forces, the surviving IAR-80s were retired and scrapped, and sadly no original examples survive today. There are a handful of static replicas, but these largely only exist in Romanian museums, and they're built from salvaged parts and photographs and sort of a bit of slapdash together, trying to get something that looks pretty accurate. But on a far happier note, since 2020, there has been a volunteer group working to build an airworthy reproduction, which, given how effective this little plane built by a small country with limited resources was, it would be fantastic to see it take to the air again. And I, for one, have always thought it looks brilliant. Reminds me of the FW-190, but somehow smoother and nicer. And given its service record, for what it was, it truly speaks for itself as a great little aircraft made by a minor power using every single resource it could to make something work. And for that reason and that alone, the IAR-80 is incredibly cool and deserves a lot more love than it gets. Thank you all for coming. I hope you all enjoyed this. Special thanks to the patron who suggested it. Love the topic. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you all next time.